Amidst the pain and emptiness left by loss, Leonard believed there was no more room for faith in his life. But when a hopeful young woman and a mysterious stranger cross his path, he will be forced to confront everything he has always denied. Do miracles really happen? And how far can faith take us, even when all seems lost? The sun was shining brightly when Leonard opened the doors of the small restaurant he maintained in the city center. The place, once vibrant and full of life, was now just a shadow of the dream he had shared with his late wife, Ellen. The old photographs on the walls were the last witnesses of the days when they both fought together to transform that space into a welcoming meeting point for the community. But time had been merciless to Leonard, leaving him bitter, hardened by the scars of loss. At 52, Leonard looked much older. The lines on his face carried the weight of a suffering he refused to share with anyone. Since Ellen's death, a victim of cancer that quickly consumed her, Leonard had distanced himself from everyone, including Daniel, his only son. The pain of loss pushed him into an abyss of skepticism and disbelief. He mocked everything, especially the faith that had once sustained him. Now all that was left was his restaurant and a routine he followed dispassionately. That morning, while organizing orders, Leonard was interrupted by the entrance of Sophia, the new employee who had been hired a few days earlier. At just 19 years old, Sophia radiated contagious energy. Her smile was bright, and her eyes held a hope that Leonard found naive. She greeted the other employees with a lightness that directly contrasted Leonard's gravity. The small cross-shaped necklace she wore around her neck revealed an unshakable faith that intrigued Leonard, although he would never admit it. As Sophia set the tables, her faith was evident in every gesture. She spoke about her beliefs with a naturalness that bothered Leonard. He avoided this type of conversation as much as possible, but that morning, Sophia mentioned something that made him stop. "I believe that God is always guiding us, even in the most difficult times," she said, with the same serenity as always. Leonard laughed bitterly. "Do you really believe this nonsense?" He responded sarcastically, without taking his eyes off the counter where he was preparing coffee. If God existed, would the world be like this? Would he allow so much suffering? Sophia, used to facing skeptics, was unfazed. She knew the story of Leonard and the loss of his wife, although she had never directly spoken about it. In a soft voice, she replied, "I believe God has a plan for all of us, Mr. Leonard. Even when we don't understand, He is with us." Leonard turned around, his eyes filled with disbelief. "A plan?" he repeated with contempt. "If He has a plan, it's horrible. Because in my experience, He just likes to see people suffer." The silence that followed was filled with tension, but Sophia didn't back down. On the contrary, his gaze remained firm, full of compassion. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Leonard," she said softly. "But I believe that, even in the darkest moments, He does not abandon us. Maybe He is trying to show you something." Leonard watched her, disturbed. He didn't want to admit it, but something about Sophia's words affected him deeply. Although his bitterness and skepticism were still stronger, a small seed of doubt was beginning to form in his heart. That Friday, the restaurant Leonard worked as usual. Regular customers occupied the tables, and the sound of cutlery and conversations filled the atmosphere. Sophia, always smiling, served with the same joy and enthusiasm as always. For customers, the restaurant was a comfortable place, but for Leonard, it was just a refuge where he could hide from the pain he carried. Suddenly, the phone rang on the counter. It was a familiar sound, but at that moment, it seemed like an omen of something terrible. Leonard answered absently, expecting it to be a supplier or a customer. "Leonard's restaurant, good morning," he replied in a firm voice. On the other end of the line, a serious voice stopped him. "Mr. Leonard, this is Dr. Caroline Martin, from the Central Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Daniel." For a brief moment, Leonard's world stopped. The doctor's voice continued, but it seemed distant, as if she were talking about a reality he couldn't accept. Daniel suffered a serious accident in the city center. He is in a coma and in critical condition. It is important that you come to the hospital as soon as possible. Leonard hung up the phone without saying a word. He stood there in silence, trying to process what he had just heard. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, but he refused to believe them. Desperation began to form in his chest, and the image of Ellen, his deceased wife, invaded his thoughts like a ghost he couldn't shake. It was like reliving the nightmare of losing someone you loved deeply, this time your own son. Sophia, who had been watching Leonard from a distance, noticed something wrong. He approached slowly, his expression full of concern. "Mr. Leonard, is everything okay?" she asked softly. Leonard looked at her, but his eyes were distant, caught in the pain that was beginning to overwhelm him. With a trembling voice, he finally replied, "My son. Daniel, he's in a coma. I don't know if he'll survive." The impact of the news left Leonard in a state of shock. He couldn't believe his son was on the verge of death. The pain was overwhelming, bringing back memories of when Ellen was fighting cancer. He remembered the days spent in the hospital, the prayers he said and the pleas that went unanswered. The same feeling of helplessness began to overwhelm him. Sophia, sensing Leonard's desperation, placed her hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Leonard, I'm sorry. I'll pray for Daniel and you. I know God is with you." But Leonard, overcome with rage, abruptly pulled her hand away. "There is no need for prayers," he replied, his voice firm, although shaky. "God has already taken the one I loved most. Now he wants to take my son too. No, there is nothing your prayers can do." Sophia was silent, respecting Leonard's pain, but in her heart, she believed that faith could bring comfort, even if he didn't see it now. She knew it was a minefield and didn't insist. However, her words resonated with Leonard in a way he didn't want to admit. There was something about Sophia's presence that disarmed him. Perhaps it was the calmness with which she spoke about God, or the certainty in her words that disturbed him deeply. Even though he tried to deny it, a small doubt began to form in his heart. But his anger and skepticism were still stronger. Leonard hurried out of the restaurant, leaving everyone behind, including Sophia, who was watching him with a mixture of concern and hope. He needed to go to the hospital, face whatever was coming. However, the battle he was fighting within himself had already begun long before. Upon arriving at the hospital, Leonard felt as if each step was heavier than the last. The cold, white hallways transported him back to the past, reliving the moments he spent next to Ellen during the last days of his life. Now, he was here, about to face another possible tragedy. When he finally arrived at the ICU, he was greeted by Dr. Caroline, the doctor who had called him. "Mr. Leonard, Daniel is in a coma, and his condition is critical. We will do everything we can, but the next few hours are decisive." The doctor took him to the bed where his son was. Daniel, who was once full of life and energy, was now immobile, connected to machines that kept his body functioning. Leonard approached slowly, feeling his heart tighten. He held Daniel's hand, feeling the coldness of his son's skin contrasting with the desperate heat of his heart. "Daniel," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The sight of his son in that condition devastated Leonard in a way he didn't know was possible. He fell to his knees beside the bed, unable to hold back the tears he had been trying to suppress for so long. Everything seemed to fall apart again, just like it did with Ellen. The only difference was that now he was completely alone. At that moment, Leonard realized that he had no control over what was happening around him, and that lack of control terrified him. Dr. Caroline watched from a distance, respecting the moment of pain, aware that there was not much to be said. She knew that science had its limits, and at that moment, not all medical technology could guarantee that Daniel would wake up. Leonard remained by his son's side for hours, lost in his thoughts, his pain, and his internal battle. After long hours of vigil at Daniel's side, Leonard felt a soft hand touch his shoulder. He turned and saw Sophia. She was there, standing, with an expression of deep compassion and understanding. "Mr. Leonard, I came to be by your side and pray for Daniel. I know it's been difficult, but I believe he will get out of this." Leonard, who was still overcome with grief, reacted with the same bitterness as always. "Pray? Sophia, I've told you before, prayers won't change anything. If God existed, he wouldn't allow my son to be like this. Nor would he have taken Ellen." His voice was filled with anger, but Sophia was unfazed. She knelt down beside Leonard, looking into his eyes, and replied softly, "I understand your pain, Mr. Leonard. I know you've been through a lot, but that doesn't mean God has abandoned you. Sometimes the answers we look for don't come the way we expect." He stood up, clearly frustrated. "You don't understand, Sophia. You can't understand. God, if he exists, only takes away what we love. I've already lost Ellen, and now I stand to lose my son. Do you really believe your prayers will change that?" Sophia, keeping her calm, replied serenely, "I believe that even in the most difficult times, he is with us. Daniel is in a coma, yes, but as long as there is life, there is hope. God does not let us fight alone." Leonard sighed deeply, the weight of his emotions spilling over. He looked at Sophia, and although he wanted to continue denying it, something in her words was beginning to penetrate the barriers he had erected. He was still far from believing, but the doubts he previously avoided began to emerge more strongly. Sophia, sensing the hesitation, concluded, "I won't insist, Mr. Leonard, but know that I continue to pray for you and Daniel. And if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." She stepped aside, giving space to Leonard, who was now caught in an even more intense battle between skepticism and the possibility of something greater. After days of anguish and uncertainty, Leonard continued to live between the restaurant and the hospital, where Daniel remained in a coma. The weight of guilt and fear accompanied him at every step. Although he tried to focus on work, his mind always returned to the image of Daniel lying motionless, connected to the machines. The faith that Sophia spoke of, even if it touched something inside him, still seemed distant, unattainable. One afternoon, while the restaurant was quieter, the door opened and an elderly man entered. He wore simple, worn clothes, clearly homeless. Samuel, as he presented himself, had piercing blue eyes and an expression of serenity unusual for someone in his situation. Leonard frowned when he saw him, already preparing to dismiss him, as he usually did to anyone who came in asking for something. But before Leonard could speak, Samuel said calmly, "Good afternoon, sir. Sorry to bother you, but I'm really hungry and I saw you were closing the restaurant. Could you get me something to eat?" The respectful tone and tranquility in Samuel's eyes disarmed Leonard. He turned around without saying a word and began preparing a plate of the day's leftovers. As he placed the plate in front of the man, Leonard hesitated. "Do you still believe in God even though you live like this?" he asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Samuel, without losing his smile, replied, "Yes, I believe it. Every day, I am grateful for life. I know I don't have much, but God always puts someone in my path, like he did today, through you." Leonard, used to being cynical, couldn't help but reflect on those words. How could anyone thank God living on the streets, without food or comfort? As Samuel ate, Leonard remained silent, his beliefs beginning to be questioned in a way he was not prepared for. Sitting at the opposite table, Leonard watched Samuel curiously. I couldn't understand how this man, who apparently had nothing, exuded serenity and unshakable faith. That disturbed him. Leonard, who had lost so much, felt like his faith had been ripped away along with Ellen, and now Daniel. How could anyone see God in the midst of so much difficulty? Samuel, noticing Leonard's gaze, continued, "Life isn't always easy, Mr. Leonard. I've lost everything I had, but I still have my faith. God has never abandoned me, even in the worst of times. He always finds a way to help me, just like today, through your generosity. The old man's words weighed heavily on Leonard. He sighed deeply, and for a moment, he found himself unable to argue. There was something different about this man. It wasn't like the others. His faith seemed genuine, not based on naive optimism. He seemed to have faced the same pain as Leonard, but unlike him, he hadn't lost his hope. "If he wasn't with you, then what would you say?" Leonard asked, challenging Samuel with his usual disbelief. Samuel, with a slight smile, replied, "God never abandons us, Mr. Leonard, even when we think we are alone. He always guides us, even if we don't understand why. Life tests us, but it's up to us to choose to get up and continue." The simple but profound words echoed in Leonard's mind. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to answer. Something inside him was beginning to change. He still didn't fully believe it, but the seed of doubt was there, growing. When Samuel finished the meal, he thanked her sincerely. "Thank you, sir. May God bless you for your kindness." Leonard nodded, still lost in thought. Something had changed. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if, perhaps, there was something more than his pain and disbelief. Days have passed since the visit of Samuel, but the old man's words still resonated in his mind. "Leonard." He tried to push them away, but something inside him wouldn't let him ignore the message. The faith, which he had buried deep after the death of Ellen, seemed to insist on germinating. But Leonard didn't have time to ponder too much. The state of Daniel he was still critical, and he spent hours at the hospital with his son, waiting for any sign of improvement. That morning, when I walked into the hospital, something seemed different. The atmosphere was lighter, and the nurses seemed more upbeat. Leonard approached Dr. Caroline, who gave her a gentle smile, a rare gesture from her. "Mr. Leonard, there is something you need to see," she said, leading him to the ICU room where Daniel was. When Leonard entered, he felt his heart quicken. Daniel, who until then had been immobile, showed signs of life. His fingers had moved, and with effort, his eyes began to slowly open. The miracle Leonard was so afraid to believe in was happening right before his eyes. He approached quickly, holding his son's hand tightly. "Daniel? Can you hear me?" Leonard's voice was shaky, filled with a hope he barely dared to feel. Daniel blinked slowly, as if he was struggling to regain consciousness, but the mere fact that he was reacting was more than Leonard could ask for. Dr. Caroline watched him with a wary look, but there was also a contained joy in her expression. "We can't say anything for sure yet, Mr. Leonard, but the fact that he's showing signs of improvement is a good indication. We'll continue to monitor closely." Leonard, unable to contain his tears, turned to Sophia, who was there by his side, always with his usual calmness. "I don't know what to say, maybe you're right. Maybe there's something bigger that I can't understand." Leonard's heart was in a whirlwind of emotions. Everything he had denied for so long was beginning to crumble before something he could no longer ignore. Daniel, he was getting better, something he considered impossible. Samuel's words and the unshakable faith of Sophia, they now seemed to make more sense than he had ever imagined. As they walked out of the ICU, Leonard stopped in the hallway and looked at Sophia. "I know I've been hard on you, Sophia, but your prayers, maybe they've made a difference. I don't know if I'm ready to believe it, but for once, I'm trying." Sophia, with a soft smile, replied, "God never asks us to believe right away, Mr. Leonard. He only asks us to try. Every step we take toward him is important." Leonard shook his head, feeling a weight slowly being lifted from his shoulders. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this. Daniel. I thought I lost him. And maybe, for a while, I lost more than him. I lost myself, my faith, everything. But now I see that maybe I was wrong about a lot of things." The way back to the restaurant felt different. There was a lightness in Leonard's step that he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel hope. The old restaurant, which had once been just a refuge from his pain, now seemed like a place where he could start over. When he arrived at the restaurant, Leonard sat down at one of the tables. The sun was beginning to set, and a soft golden light illuminated the place. He closed his eyes for a moment and, not sure what to say, simply murmured, "God, if you're listening, thank you." Leonard didn't know what the future held for him, but he was willing to move forward. The faith, which he had once lost, began to find space again in his heart. Now, he was ready to take the next step, with Daniel by his side, and perhaps, with something bigger guiding him. The days following the miracle of Daniel were full of joy and relief to Leonard. Each hospital visit brought new hope as Daniel took small steps toward recovery. He started opening his eyes more often, and soon, small smiles appeared when Leonard spoke to him. It was as if life had decided to offer Leonard a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. Finally, the big day arrived. Daniel was conscious enough to be moved to a regular room. Leonard watched, his heart full of gratitude, as the nurses adjusted the equipment around his son's bed. Daniel was still weak, but the worst was over. The battle for life had been won, and Leonard knew he was no longer alone in this fight. Sophia continued to visit the hospital daily. His presence was constant, and his faith unwavering, something Leonard now deeply appreciated. During one of these visits, she brought a small gift for Daniel, a simple Bible, with a dedication written on the first page. "So that you never forget that miracles happen." When Daniel opened the gift, his eyes lit up with excitement. He knew, even without words, that something bigger had happened to him. He looked at his father and Sophia, and with a weak smile, he murmured, "I guess I'm proof that you were right, Sophia." Leonard laughed, relieved, as he felt a comforting warmth inside him. He began to understand that faith did not need to be a burden, but rather a source of hope. Daniel's complete recovery would still take time, but the path was already clear. And with each day that passed, Leonard felt stronger, more connected to something he had ignored for so long. Now, he was ready to face the future with a renewed heart. Back at the restaurant, life was beginning to return to normal, but what Leonard didn't imagine was that normality would take on a new meaning. The words of Samuel and the moments with Sophia and Daniel had transformed something inside him. The skepticism that had defined him for years was dissipating, and in its place was growing a cautious but real faith. One day, while organizing the restaurant, Leonard received an unexpected visitor. Sophia, as usual, arrived to provide support, but there was something different in her eyes. She seemed more excited than usual. "Mr. Leonard, I wanted to ask you something," she began, with a smile on her face. Leonard looked curious. "What is it, Sophia?" "I wanted to invite you to come to church with me next Sunday," she said, her tone soft but firm. "I'm not asking you to believe everything at once, but I think it would be good for you. It's a chance to find some peace and continue on this path you've already started." Leonard hesitated for a moment. He hadn't set foot in a church since Ellen died, and the idea of returning seemed challenging. However, something inside him wanted to accept it. It wasn't just about faith, but about the opportunity to reconnect with something he had lost. He looked at Sophia, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. She had been one of the few people who had been by his side in his darkest moments. To refuse would be to deny the new perspective he was building. Finally, Leonard nodded. "It's okay, Sophia. I'll go. Maybe it's time to try something different." Sophia smiled, visibly moved. "I knew you would. Sometimes the first step is the hardest, but it's the most important." With that small deal, Leonard knew something big was about to happen. Next Sunday would be more than just a visit to church, it would mark a new beginning, a journey he was finally willing to take on with an open heart. When Sunday came, Leonard he felt strangely anxious. It had been years since he had been inside a church, and the last time had been during the final moments of his death. Ellen. At that time, he begged for a miracle, but nothing happened, and bitterness has accompanied him ever since. Now, the idea of returning to that place seemed like the last step in facing his past and, somehow, finding a peace he didn't know he was still looking for. Sophia met him in front of the restaurant, with a welcoming and confident smile. "Are you ready?" she asked, knowing how much this meant to Leonard. He nodded, although a little tensely, and together they walked to the small church at the end of the street. The soft lights emanating from the temple seemed to invite them, and Leonard felt a mix of nostalgia and apprehension as he walked through the door. The atmosphere was simple, but filled with a calm energy. Sophia he found a bench near the altar and motioned for Leonard to sit next to him. As he looked around, he saw unfamiliar faces, but the place itself brought back powerful memories. There, he had married Ellen. There he prayed for a son. And there, too, he felt that he had lost everything. The sermon began and, to Leonard's surprise, it was not about rigid dogmas or impositions of faith. It was about hope, about the power of redemption and forgiveness. Every word seemed directed at him, as if someone knew exactly what he needed to hear. He closed his eyes and for a moment allowed the message to sink deep into his heart. When the sermon ended, Sophia looked at him with an encouraging smile. "How was it?" she asked, knowing that the experience would be significant. Leonard, his eyes slightly teary, just whispered, "It was necessary." The first step had been taken. There wasn't a complete transformation at that moment, but Leonard knew something inside him was moving. The pain he had carried for so long was starting to give way to something bigger. The months following the church visit brought a series of changes for Leonard. Daniel he was recovering more and more, and his life began to return to a state of normality. However, this new normality was different from the previous one. There was more lightness, more gratitude in each gesture. The faith of Leonard it grew slowly, like a plant that sprouts carefully, but with strong roots. At the restaurant, things have also changed. Samuel he never appeared again, but his words continued to resonate in Leonard's mind. He knew that this man had fulfilled a greater purpose in his life. Leonard even started helping more people, extending a hand to anyone in need, inspired by the simple act of generosity that Samuel awakened in him. On a certain day, during a quiet afternoon, Daniel and Sophia they arrived at the restaurant with news that filled Leonard's heart with joy. They were engaged. The love that grew between the two during Daniel's recovery was visible to everyone, but hearing the official confirmation left Leonard speechless. "I wanted to thank you, Dad," said Daniel, moved. "You were the pillar that held everything together when I couldn't. And now, we have the chance to start a new life together." Leonard hugged his son tightly, feeling that the cycle of pain and loss was finally closing. Now, the future he so feared to face seemed brighter, more promising. The wedding between Daniel and Sophia would not only be a celebration of love, but a reaffirmation of faith, hope and second chances. When the big day arrived, the church where Leonard found his faith again was full of friends and family. He watched with pride as Daniel and Sophia exchanged vows, aware that that moment symbolized much more than a union between two people. It was the closing of a cycle of pain and the beginning of a new life, full of promises. At the end of the ceremony, while everyone said goodbye, Leonard remained alone in the church for a few moments. He looked at the altar and, for the first time in years, knelt in prayer. "Thank you," he whispered, not asking for anything else, just saying thank you. And with that, Leonard finally found the peace he was looking for, surrounded by love, faith and new possibilities that life, in its grace, had granted him.